Thank you very much, sir, for your valuable speech on sustainable tourism development through tourism in Bangladesh. Dear audience, now we will begin with our plenary session. I'm very proud to say we already have Professor Dr. Colin Micheal Hall from New Zealand already have joined with us. To begin with the plenary session, we will first have Professor Dr. Colin Micheal Hall. I would like to take the opportunity to say a bit about Professor Dr. Colin Micheal Hall. Professor Micheal Hall is currently Professor of Department of Management, Marketing and Entrepreneurship at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. And his topic will be for today's session, can we learn from our mistakes, sustainability and sustainable tourism in a pandemic world. Professor Colin Micheal Hall is currently a professor in the Department of Management at the University of Canterbury, Christchurch, New Zealand. A docent in the Department of Geography, University of Oulu, Finland, and in recent years has been a visiting professor at the several institutions, including Linnaeus University and Lund campus, Sweden, the University of Eastern Finland, Sheffield Hallam University in the UK, and Southern Cross University in Australia. His PhD was from the University of Western Australia and his master's from the University of Waterloo in Canada. Professor Micheal Hall has published widely on tourism related issues, but also writes on issues relating to environmental history, environmental change, regional studies, and gastronomy. He has written or edited over 60 books with translation in Arabic, Chinese, French, Korean, Portuguese, and Spanish, as well as over 400 journal articles and book chapters. Some of his more recent books including Tourism and Climate Change, Impact, Adaptation, and Mitigation, Fieldwork in Tourism, Methods, Issues, and Reflections, and Polar Tourism and Change, Climate, Environment, and Experiences. Current research primarily focus on second homes and multiple dwelling, tourism and climate change, food tourism, tourism politics, and power, and the development of steady state approaches to tourism. In 2011, he has lost his house in Christchurch earthquake and has since started studying the relationship between tourism and loss of sense of place and belonging following environmental change. Dear audience, I would also like to mention Professor Colin Micheal Hall. I'm very proud today. He is one of the topmost professor in our time. So please welcome Professor Colin Micheal Hall to deliver his speech on today's session. Professor Colin Micheal Hall, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you much for the very kind introduction. What I'd like to do today is deal with some major issues we have in tourism and think about how we can learn from our mistakes. Clearly, we have an enormous focus at the moment in terms of COVID-19, but the challenges facing us all are much more than just COVID-19. We have the economic recession behind it. And then behind that, we have climate change. And arguably, even more importantly, when we look at the wider scene, we have issues of biodiversity and biodiversity collapse. What I'd like to do today is deal with some of these issues. Think of the big picture, because that big picture is going to affect us all, whether we are in Bangladesh, whether we are in New Zealand, whether we are in Korea, no matter where we are in the world, it's going to be of importance. How, therefore, do we respond? How do we understand what needs to be done? I've been teaching now far too long and researching on sustainable tourism. I think my first paper came out before I'd even got my PhD. I've been talking about sustainability as long as Brundtland's report has been out, but we haven't got any more sustainable. I don't think it's just me. I think it's the wider academic community, as well as stakeholders and politicians. In terms of thinking about growth, we have a situation in which we've had more publications about sustainability and sustainable tourism than ever before, but ironically, we are less sustainable. There's an inverse relationship between the two. We have gone through a whole series of other ways of thinking about alternative tourism. We've gone through alternative tourism itself, eco-tourism, green tourism, responsible tourism, ethical tourism, slow tourism, pro-poor tourism. I keep going, steady state tourism. And now, of course, we're concerned about over-tourism. And even in the time of COVID-19, we are concerned about over-tourism. Why? Because in some locations, those domestic tourists, well, those people who were going overseas and become domestics, and they're now concentrating elsewhere. We are moving the problem around. We are not necessarily solving it. And that problem is being sustainable, not just economically, but what we depend upon most of all in terms of the environment. We are environmentally dependent. If we do not have good water or good air and the biodiversity to support it, we are not sustainable. End of story. And that's the challenge that we face, both in terms of our research and in terms of the industry. And so now we've gone through various stages of thinking about sustainability over the last 50 odd years or so. So that now we focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. They're important. And I will finish on that note of how important they are. But we have to think of how do we respond to that? And in particular, what about the human footprint? We have a global ecological footprint. And it means that over my lifetime, the situation's changed. And what happens is that in terms of the ecological footprint that we have, the resources that you and I and everyone uses, is that we are taking more of that natural capital away from wildlife. So that we now have a situation that over my lifetime, over your lifetimes, we've moved from a situation in which we've been using half of the plant's biocapacity to now emitting waste 40% faster, and in fact slightly higher than what the biosphere, the planet, can renew. We have a deficit. We have a deficit in terms of natural capital. We have a deficit in terms of biocapacity. And this is absolutely critical to tourism, because think of how dependent, for example, many tourism industries and many tourism businesses are on the environment, having an attractive location to go to, and particularly in somewhere like Bangladesh, being able to go to some of the national parks. What if they would disappear? From an international perspective, why then come to Bangladesh? And that same kind of issue applies to many other places as well. And of course, the problem that we have is that in terms of consumption, even under current favorable thinking, that ecological debt is going to get worse. In fact, it's going to become a physical impossibility. Why? Because we only have one planet. We only have one planet, and it's all our consumption, all added up. And there's the effect that we have. My life, your life, our children, what will they be, and how does tourism play into this? In one sense, elements of this talk are things I've had in my teaching and in my research and in some of my publications with colleagues for many years. But that doesn't necessarily mean it has any impact. And some I'd argue that as a researcher, and yes, I probably do publish most of most people in my field, but what it does have. And the challenge I constantly face is how do we communicate this most effectively, particularly when the news may not be very popular. And I think in terms of what I'm posing today, my news may not be very popular, but it's the honest truth. And if you have to speak truth to power, then so be it. I think in terms of how we think about sustainability, we have a fundamental problem. How we usually tackle it is in terms of efficiency, not sufficiency. The common idea which is promoted by industry, by business, by the UNWTO, by other organizations, is that by becoming more efficient, becoming more productive and efficient in our use of materials and energy, we will have green growth. Well, that's partly true, but I'm not sure how green it's going to be because we have some fundamental problems with respect to efficiency. If we get efficiency gains in terms of, for example, how much energy inputs into a system and therefore how much emissions comes out, what happens with those energy savings? What happens with those monetary savings? Well, we've actually known about this for about 150 plus years. It's called a rebound effect, what was originally called the coal paradox by Stanley Johns. And you know what happens? We go invest that energy, we go invest that money in something else. Think about that side. We only have one planet, so it still means what are you reinvesting that in? And unfortunately, it means that you're going to be consuming other energy, other resources by that reinvestment. Now, I'm not saying that energy efficiency isn't good. Do not get me wrong. I am not saying that. I'm saying, though, there is a problem in how we treat the savings from efficiency. Where are they reinvested? If they are not reinvested somewhere which is carbon free, then you have a problem. We have a problem. So therefore, in terms of being able to try and manage the situation, it's not just a case of thinking about efficiency, which is just thinking about production, but it's also a case of thinking about sufficiency, consumer behavior, what we consume. And that is a much more challenging prospect in terms of tourism, because it means we just can't, continue adding winglets to planes. We just can't continue trying to have maximum capacity to reduce passenger emissions per kilometre. We just can't do that. It's not sufficient. And, and for example, with the efficiency perspective, you've had efficiency gains at the most optimistic, 1.5%, maybe 2% in terms of international tourism. But think of how international tourism was growing pre-COVID-19. It's growing much more than what the efficiency gains were. And that is a problem that occurs throughout the entire aviation and transport system and in hospitality as well. And as I'm going to be arguing, COVID-19 is just a short blip in happening in terms of tourism and growth in the economy. Only a temporary kind of issue. How do we then think about this in the bigger picture? How then do we have sustained consumption? How do we change our behavior? How do we persuade tourists ourselves, because we are all tourists, to consume more responsibly and more sustainably in terms of how we travel and why we travel? Do we pay the real cost of our travel? And the answer is invariably, especially if we're going internationally, no. And this is a real problem, because when we start having, as we undoubtedly will, a vaccine for COVID-19, there's going to be all this pent-up demand of people who wants to go traveling again. Now, I realize that for many locations and many countries, that's going to be wonderful in one sense. Why? Because they're concerned about jobs, they're concerned about business. I understand that. But what will it mean in terms of the environment if we just go back to business as usual? And this is an issue that affects everyone. And Bangladesh, of all countries, is aware of the issues of climate change. So the emissions of someone, for argument's sake, flying between New Zealand and Europe, or New Zealand and the United States, don't just affect those countries, it affects Bangladesh and other countries as well. Which means we have to think not just short term, but we have to think long term if we're going to deal with sustainability. How are we going to respond? Technology by itself may be becoming more efficient. It is not sufficient to respond to the problem. How do we respond, therefore? How do we intervene? If we're trying to summarize that, we can argue that we have 4 different types of interventions: education, marketing, regulation, and of course there's the do nothing, which is very popular with many governments and many people in industry, and actually many academics as well. Why? Because there's this belief we will solve the problem later. It's not that you don't think it's a problem, it's just not your most immediate one if you're in business. If you're in business, your most immediate problem is having someone coming through the door. Climate change, oh, but that's important, I'll deal with that later. Governments think the same way. And unless you've been directly impacted by some type of weather event that makes you think otherwise, in the case of climate change, it's always something you put back later. But the problem is that eventually that later comes back to you and it affects you directly, and it affects tourism directly. How therefore do we respond? And the big question I'm posing today is, how do some type of interventions get selected and not others? What's the basis for that? And there are a number of reasons. It depends on government attitude, government philosophy. It depends where power lies. It depends on notions of rights. And obviously, it depends on the nature of the target audience. But as an educator, and as many of you here will appreciate, we know that education doesn't always work. You can teach people something, how much they remember it, how much they put it into effect. And so therefore, if we're looking to have major change, which I'm arguing is what we need to respond to all the crises that we face, if we're going to be capable of some kind of change, then we need to go beyond what we might describe as third order change. Just incremental change, routine change, business as usual change. What is that characterized by? Educating people. But as I'll be arguing, that is not enough. For more substantial change, if we're still focusing on the individual, then maybe social marketing and nudging becomes more significant. However, if you want to change paradigms, change technologies, change systems, then maybe the type of intervention you need has to be different. Voting differently. And we all know what an issue that is at the moment in the world. It means protest as a form of marketing. Yes, protest is a form of marketing. It's a consumer response to issues. How do we then come up with different structures? And one of the problems that we have, both in terms of policy making, in terms of industry, and in terms of academia, is that most thinking about change is in the ABC model. ABC, attitudes, drive behavior, then drive change, or what's chosen. A nice idea, but doesn't always work that way. It's a common sense idea. It's a real problem though, how we respond. Because it's driven by a particular way of thinking about the agenda and a different way of trying to think about the world. It sounds very appealing, the ABC model. Attitude leads to behavior, leads to some kind of choice and change. It's been around for quite a long time, and it doesn't necessarily work. And therefore, one of the issues that we have is, how do we change the norms we live by and other people live by and travel by when things do not work? The problem is the ABC approach seems so attractive that so many governments follow it. Yet it is a real issue because it isn't working. That has been the dominant approach we've had for the last 20, 30 years in terms of behavior change. We'll think about efficiency and we'll follow ABC. If people have the right attitudes, they'll change their behaviors. Let's try and educate them in terms of having the right attitudes. Doesn't necessarily work. So therefore, what does it take to go beyond the first 3 letters of the alphabet? How do we go beyond ABC? I think there's several things that we should need to do. We need to acknowledge the extent to which the state, government, industry configure our daily lives. We need to think about the everyday practices that we have, whether in tourism or whatever. And in fact, using Zoom is a great example of this. We take using those technologies for granted. We do not think about the impacts of those technologies. Where does the energy come from? When we go flying, what is the impact of that? No matter what we do, we have an impact. We can't avoid that, but we have to think through how we respond, how we understand the effects it has. And that means going beyond our daily behaviors. I'm really looking at them critically in terms of travel and tourism. And it therefore means, yes, norms are important, but why do we have the habits that we do? And most of our travel is habitual. How we fly, where we want to go to, what we want to do. It's habits. Consumerism is about habits. Travel is about habits. Some people may go to the same destination. Some people may choose different destinations, but it's still tied up in terms of the habit they have now about travel. So how do therefore we do respond to that? In fact, one of the issues that we have to try and get beyond ABC is, do we even understand B? Do we really understand behavior? Most of our understanding is very partial. Why? Because it comes from some perspectives, not others. We don't have a grand view. I know when I was working on the social marketing book, one of the things that horrified me in terms of going through health marketing literature, for example, is how much of the marketing interventions is based on theory which has not been actually very well empirically tested. Yes, you pick up an academic paper, there is mention of that theory, but is it actually tested? No, it's not. How, therefore, does most marketing happen? Well, it happens because, in one way, because it's been done that way for so many years, that we carry on doing it. We carry on using pamphlets because we think they're going to work, and that's what's been done. We can show something in terms of our efforts. It does not necessarily mean that behaviors change. And one of the things that horrifies me, for example, there's a lack of long-term studies on behavioral change. We do not know how sustainability interventions are. And, you know, we can think, you know, for example, of people seeing a documentary or a movie and then think, I'll change my behavior. And usually when you do the research, you suddenly find that 10, 12 weeks later, well, they've gone back to what they were doing before. How, therefore, do we change behaviors and make sure they're sustainable behaviors? Most of the metrics of behavior change, for example, are often in terms of recognition of the campaign and the branding that goes with it, rather than the actual behavior change. So, for example, in New Zealand, there was a campaign in recent years encouraging people to go out and exercise more, walk more, has environmental benefits and health benefits. I think about half the population could recognize the actual campaign when asked and prompted, so very successful that way, but did they actually change behaviors? Well, actually, no. There was no great increase over time in terms of people going out walking. The challenge, therefore, to change lies in a number of different approaches and a number of different interventions. What makes us change? And here's where we get to issues of governance. Because what I want to be arguing, how we think about decision making of the consumer is related to the interventions that we choose, and is also related to certain ways in which we think about governance. These things are mutually enforcing. And of course, if you think about a problem in a certain way, we all know that you'll get a certain answer. Garbage in, garbage out. You define a problem will affect the answer that you get. So therefore, how do we define the problem? This affects our capacity to change. And in terms of how we often think about tourism, there's so much emphasis on deregulation or self-regulation, an old notion that an institution is good because there's cooperation and networking. But the problem that we have is that what is the value of cooperation and networking if the values which are being promoted are inappropriate? And as I've would argue for a long time, if the ethical value is one of individual choice and it leads to increased problems in terms of the environment, then how ethical is it? For example, we think about this in terms of tourism. If we look at definitions, excluding COVID-19, if we think about that, what does it actually mean? Because I mean, these are the forecasts, and they're not very optimistic. And the irony in all of this actually is that to respond to aviation and tourism and decarbonizing it is not very expensive. If we're thinking about, for example, decarbonization, some colleagues and myself, Stefan Gosling, Dan Scott, Paul Peters, and I did a paper several years ago, which actually looked at how much would it cost to have a carbon neutral holiday in terms of using offsetting and other measures. If we looked at the average of all tourist trips, international and domestic, do you know how much it would cost? $11 American per traveler. That's how much it would have cost to actually have a carbon neutral holiday. It really isn't that much. But think of other fees you pay, other taxes, it could be lost in that. How much interest was there from industry? Not very much. Why? Because they don't want to buy into it. That's why. Any cost, any extra cost is seen as a negative because it is the general public which pays for the real impact of tourism and the real environmental cost. And this is the real problem of change, because how we convince government and industry that something which is actually relatively cheap to invest now and is actually a really good economic investment is worthwhile engaging in. Why don't they buy in? My argument, of course, is that it gets back to issues of intervention selection. It means dealing with the reality of what happens with intervention selection. It's not just a case of tourism as not being seen as significant. It's a case of realizing that what those who argue in terms of decarbonization and sustainability are on about is opposed by commercial and political interests. And often their advice is quite separate from one that scientists come up with. It's a problem in many countries. Stakeholders see costs in many instances unless government are willing to regulate. And there's a level playing field. But just coming up with another campaign does not solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem. It's a case of actually leading to genuine change. Just recognizing that we have another campaign and, okay, there's a brand for that, doesn't help us. We have to go further. And it means that if we're being absolutely honest in terms of change, we need to acknowledge that interventions are inherently political, because some people will benefit and some won't. There is no such thing as an absolute win-win when it comes to change. It doesn't exist. And there needs to be recognition that that is the case, because that therefore affects how we try and argue for these things. If we're looking to change consumption structures, it means challenging particular ways in which some people benefit and others don't. In terms of the divide between rich and poor, whether within a country or within the globe, it means there needs to be reallocation, surely. And that is an argument that for some, especially those who have more money than others, is not very appealing. But that's the reality of what we face. And it means also thinking about, why do we approach sustainability in some ways? In the case of that, what we need to realize is there are different ways of looking at these problems. So you have some approaches which are utilitarian, economics 101, and there's that belief the market will solve things. Well, no, actually it won't. It doesn't solve everything. The problem also with the utilitarian approach and notions of consumer sovereignty is that yes, the consumer is important, but just giving information to the consumer doesn't solve the problem. We all can think of social and environmental issues where people can be given information. It doesn't mean they change their behavior. So therefore we move to more of a behavioral economics approach, a social marketing approach, where we think about social norms and behaviors and think of how communities can move people in one direction than another. It worked in some areas, not others. But arguably, in terms of what we need to cover in terms of interventions, we need to think of the system. What is the system? How is consumption constrained and shaped by society, technology, and institutions? And this is where habit becomes important. Because as I would argue, most of our consumption is habitual. How therefore do we respond to that? We need to move from the situation of just being literate about a problem and being educated about a problem, which is a classic approach, and there is a role for education and social marketing there, to one in which we become capable of solving a problem. And that is a different issue. Because to become capable of solving the big issues of sustainability and, I would argue, COVID-19, it's a case of also thinking about what is the system of provision? What is available? How are health resources allocated? On need or on wealth, and why? What is the divide between urban rich and rural poor? Why is that there? How can that be dealt with? Or do we treat with these problems as an entire country? These are real issues, but it's about the system, not just individual choice, because you can have, for example, a situation where someone or a business wants to consume renewable energy, but then the energy supplier is run on coal or oil, and they cannot afford themselves to maybe install solar. And the system and how government encourage that system constrains the direction you can go. And it therefore means that in terms of marketing and trying to influence change, it's not just a case of thinking about education and social marketing in terms of the consumer. It's also about thinking of how do we try and influence and change the system. Ultimately, it's the system. And we can have individuals rightly trying to change their behaviors, but the system has to enable them. So to what extent systems and the tourism system enable that? And often it doesn't. It's, in terms of argument's sake, being able to offset your flying. How easy is that? Rather than making it an automatic part of the ticket, or being able to use your frequent flyer points to do it, it's usually done as an add-on. It's offered at all, and many airlines still do not offer it. Rather than making it a part of the system to solve the problem, it's done on a voluntary basis because the problem is defined wrongly in terms of just the consumer, when it's not just the consumer, it's also the system themselves. It therefore means we have to understand the big picture and how what we try and intervene and change fits in to the bigger system. And of course, the role of media and other actors in this, because what I'm saying is not popular in the slightest with some actors. They want to ignore it because it's about them and their interests and their, I won't use the word selfishness, but their perspective. And I understand in many cases where that comes from, having worked in the industry, I understand. But that doesn't help the big picture, does it? And of course, to enable those businesses to change and those actors to change, you need to have regulation for all that evens out the playing field, to use that old cliche. That is what you need, because regulation can actually encourage environmental and social innovation if it's done properly. And it creates issues as well, because we have to think not just how do we influence conscious behavior, but how do we influence unconscious behavior and habits. And that is where, in particular, where regulation becomes important. Provision of public transport for tourists becomes important. Thinking about the technologies that we use. Thinking about using pricing and location to change access. I'm not saying not to travel. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that the real cost of travel need to be covered, and it needs to be done in such a way that is socially equitable. If we are looking, therefore, to transition or transform tourism, which is a very popular term at the moment, to COVID-19, in order to be able to do it, we have to deal with the problem of lock-in. We have to be able to change the system of provision if we want to deal with emissions, biosecurity, and the long-term health effects of COVID-19. Because in terms of resilience thinking, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And that's really been borne out by COVID-19 in terms of different parts of the world. But that same rule applies in terms of tourism, particularly at a destination level. And the problem is that so many actors continue to support the carbon economy, for argument's sake, as one example, because it's in their self-interest. And it also relates to how they define the problem. And so therefore, when you have that kind of situation, to get policy change and policy learning to be effective is actually extremely difficult. Because in essence, you're challenging the basic paradigm. But if we're going to be trying to be effective in helping, as is important in many parts of the world, the rural poor, that's what we have to do. If we're genuine about resilience, which remember is about your weakest link, it is all about how tourism and others involve the poor. How do we do that? How do we look after them? Because if they're not doing very well, then the entire system isn't. So therefore, when we're thinking about change, it means not just looking at it in terms of eco-efficiency, but moving beyond that in terms of sustainable consumption. Now, and I keep wanting to emphasize, eco-efficiency is part of the story, but it's only part of the story because it's a transition. How do we move from just thinking of in terms of efficiency to thinking about the wider consumers? How do we bring them in terms of what we want to achieve? So it means thinking about our consumption and reducing throughput. Slow travel is wonderful in terms of the environment. Walking, cycling, that kind of thing. Still traveling, but at a different pace because you use less energy. And I would argue in terms of authenticity and meeting people, it's the best thing that you can do. Be a tourist on public transport or walk somewhere for a while. Meet people. Authentic experiences. In terms of other things we try and do, yes, we want to be greener, but we want to also reduce how far we travel. The problem in tourism isn't the number of trips to a great extent. It's how far people travel and how fast they want to travel. That's the challenge. So therefore, how do we respond to that? In terms of how we think about our policy orientation, it's not green growth. That may be a transition, but the problem is in terms of green growth, it's still concerned with growth. It's still using up more resources unless it's a massive change. So therefore, we need to reorient the economy. And I've got here the word degrowth. I prefer steady state. It just means right-sizing the economy on a global scale. And it means thinking about the mechanisms that we use. Now, the market is useful, But the market is only part of the story, and the market only functions with effective regulation anyway. So therefore, how do we think about cradle to cradle design? How do we think about slowing consumptions, urban design, use of public transport, and deal with our habits? We have a problem of scale. There's much discussion, for example, about over-tourism, even now. The problem with how we respond to over-tourism is that the usual solution is a managerial one. If you have over-tourism in one location, the usual solution is that we shift those people, which is fine, except when they start getting busy and we start shifting people from there. We keep shifting people around, but we have a problem. We only have one planet. It's the one that God's given us. So how do we look after that? And just shifting people around doesn't really help. So with this kind of issue, therefore, we need to be able to respond and think about this issue we had mentioned earlier of how much natural capital do we use? Because that's causing the die-off of nature. So therefore, just shifting deck chairs around or shifting people around is like being on the ship, the Titanic. You're still going to sink. There needs to be other solutions. In terms of our future, therefore, what we need to consider is how we change. Why is there change? Obviously, many people think COVID-19 is going to make a difference. I am not convinced in the slightest. I actually genuinely believe that once we have a vaccine, much will go back to normal. Yes, there will be isolated islands of change, but they will be that. Why? Because there are so many destinations, so many airlines, so many governments, so many businesses who are desperate to have people back because they want the money to come back. They want the economy to flow. And that's how they see the problem. And that is what we have to respond to. I understand the need for employment. Don't get me wrong, I understand completely. But it just means that if we're not careful, we are going to be back on the same business as usual path, and we're still going to have these problems of climate change and biodiversity, amongst others. We have to think about, therefore, how do we change social practices? And that, to me, is about changing the system as well as using marketing. It's also about thinking, how do we convert our environmental attitudes? How do we sustain sustainable behavior to make sure that people don't just do the right thing over a short period? When we're thinking about decarbonisation and sustainable tourism, we also want to be able to generate financial returns. But that actually requires regulation. It really does. An appropriate economic structure within that to happen. One of my concerns when I talk about sustainability is that I sometimes think I'm engaged in counter-marketing. Why? Because in tourism research, tourism academia, the dominant way of thinking is growth. Only about 12% of any articles in tourism, at a most generous estimate, are actually concerned with sustainability. The rest are, in one way or another, concerned about customer and growth. And that's the problem we've got, because that's where the focus is. And there's nothing wrong with growth so long as it is in a sustainable fashion. And I don't mean in terms of business. I mean sustainability in terms of the environmental dimensions as well. Because remember, ultimately, our survival and our children's survival, our lifestyle depends on the environment. So why is it always put there at the end somewhere? I think tourism is susceptible to protest. We saw that before the lockdowns in COVID-19 in terms of some destinations. Some local people have had enough. Too many people. So that means tourism is susceptible. As the issues that we face in terms of climate change get worse, tourism is a clear target in terms of protest. Why? Because people who were relatively time wealthy and money wealthy, flying around the world or flying elsewhere, that's a visual thing. So as we start dealing with this problem, we're making another problem for 5, 10 years down the line, and it really will be a problem. The other question I would pose, and this is the real issue, is do travelers ever really care? Or is travel essentially about price and how far you can travel? I don't think it is for everyone, but I think it is for some. One of the problems that we have in a lot of the discussion about sustainability is that the word balance is used. UNWTO use it, that balance between the economy, between society, and between the environment. Sounds lovely, except there isn't balanced. If we are genuinely environmentally dependent, the environment comes first in one form or another, whether short term or long term. That frames our experiences. In terms of the consumer society that we have in many countries, we have a wonderful Greek word, pleonoxia, the insatiable desire for more. Why is it that so many people believe that having yet another car, yet another fridge, yet another widget, whatever, will somehow make their life better? Most marketing is about encouraging that. And as a professor of marketing, I'm actually embarrassed by that. And I'm actually embarrassed by, in fact, in many cases, most business schools are the problem, not the solution, because this is the kind of stuff that they teach. Or they don't think about the big picture in terms of consumption and its effects. Green growth could work, possibly, but it won't. Why won't it work? Because it needs to be tied in with other things in terms of mode transport change, not traveling so far. And that therefore means in terms of encouraging that you actually need consumer change as well. And as I keep wanting to emphasize, it's not the number of trips which are important, it's how far people travel. They travel each year before COVID-19 and how fast they travel. Because the faster you travel, the more energy you consume. So in terms of change, I would argue it's not just economic analysis, it's a complete change of thinking in political economy. We need to think about new understandings of mobility, capital, bring nature in, and return on investment. And I find it remarkable, absolutely remarkable, that you have people in industry and government who are often concerned about ROI, return on investment, when it comes to thinking about a business. They don't think of it in terms of the environment and the capital for their country, or their destination, because the environment is part of that capital. It's part of your resources, and it's part of the value that drive industry. So that has become part of the equation, and it means that governance structures and the way we think about the problem, frame it, need to change. But do growth coalitions care? Do most of the industry care? I'm not sure. Why? Because in the short term, it's about other things. It's about making money immediately. I get that. I understand that. But surely we'll start developing ways of transitioning so it's possible still to earn an income and a good living and have security in terms of where you live, in terms of well-being. But it means adopting a new paradigm. So all change or no change. I think it means thinking about institutions in terms of what they do and looking at their norms and values. Does it actually contribute to change that we need? Also, in terms of thinking about change, we know that shock can be significant. As I keep emphasizing, COVID-19 is not a major shock that we need. It's not sufficient. It's one that's it will be solved in one sense in terms of vaccine fairly soon. There have been lots of pandemics that keep coming through. We know that we will recover from them. We know that. So it's not the shock that we need. It's too short term. And even, for example, you can think of the oil shock, which did change things in the short term, didn't have long-term effects. Consumerism, increased consumption, increased running down of the environment were happening. And it means that we have a problem, and the problem is the growth economy. And that's what needs to be challenged and thought about. And obviously, I'd be arguing that needs a new politics of consumption. Thinking about lifestyle and consumption as a wider issue in terms of social life, society, well-being, and politics, not just as an economic one. Equity is important here when there's such a divide between rich and poor in the world. And growth alone does not increase welfare. Welfare is an issue of the distribution of wealth, not just having wealth. It's about how the pie is divided, how we share the bread. And that's the issue which is not being asked enough by researchers and academics and by the industry, because ironically, it can actually be in their benefit if there is more redistribution, because there'd be more people traveling. So it means thinking about this and thinking about our consumption. I'm posing the question, what does it actually take to encourage people to think other? I know from my research, it's often been personally confronted by a disaster. I've lost my house in an earthquake. I understand that. And one of my reactions as a researcher when that happened was, and looking at the recovery, I'm lucky enough to live in a wealthy country. I can see how difficult it's been to respond to the earthquake and losing one's house. I have a reasonable income. My God, I do not understand, if we think of that in a wider scale in terms of climate change and environmental change, how people and places are going to cope. And I think that experience therefore changes me. So as part of that, we also need to think we are the tourists. It's not just them, it's you and me that need to be the cause and basis for change. And we need to move beyond BAU in terms of not business as usual, but Brundtland as usual. We need to think of sustainability that puts the environment first. And this is where the Sustainable Development Goals are fascinating. They are important, they are useful, but they don't necessarily confront the way in which neoliberalism is part of so much tourism policy practices, managerialism. It's the focus on growth that we have to contend with. If you keep managing for growth, you're just managing our resources into oblivion. We therefore need to go beyond Brundtland as usual and think of collaboration much wider than the public-private partnerships that the UN WTO love. They are useful, but only in a narrow sense. Genuine collaboration involves a whole community. We have known this in destination planning for many years. How therefore do we respond? If we really want to be, as the UN WTO suggests, a sector of hope, we need to shift from a growth mentality that actually understand the limits of our travel and the limits of our planet, because that's actually our home. Why, therefore, would we wreck our home? So we have a problem. But the problem is actually greater than tourism, to finish off, because it means dealing with morality in a bigger sense of how we consume and thinking about our children and what happens for them. Because we all say that we want a better life for them. Well, in order to be able to do that, we have to deal with many of the orthodoxies that we have growth and dealing with overconsumption as being good practice, because it's not. And that means, for example, in terms of destinations, don't just use the metric of how many visitors arrive, but think of the ROI, think of the return on investment. How do we get the return in terms of the broader picture of the costs and the benefits of tourism? And it may also mean that if we're looking at these issues, we have to think about issues of carrying capacity for destinations and for the planet and for countries. How many people can we actually cope with? What is responsible? We are stewards of this planet. We are stewards of the environment. How therefore do we respond to that? If we have been given this gift, how do we respond? And therefore that means thinking about the carrying capacity and thinking about population and population growth, not just in terms of how good it is for the economy, but think of it in terms of the environment. We have an uncertain future. We make the future, and we make our future not just from our own consumption. We make our future in terms of how we educate people, how we write, and how we try and influence policymakers. My encouragement is we need to do more, actually genuinely respond to the problems that we have, and genuinely start speaking truth to power. Because unless we do, my child, many of your children will not have the future we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Colin Micheal Hall. Dear audience, among you, if you have any questions, please write it on the chat box, and I will have you to ask your questions to Professor Micheal Hall. Or you can click on the raise hand button, and you will have your opportunity to ask questions.
Yusuf,
Sir.
By the time you get questions, I'd like to have a couple of words with my Professor Micheal Hall.
Please, Professor Micheal Hall, we have our Vice Chancellor, the Rector of the University, Professor Dr. Abdul Hall.
Professor Hall, good morning. I have been listening to your presentation with all my attention and interest, and a fascinating paper and a very enthusiastic presentation. And the canvas that you have actually traveled was quite spread out, difficult for many people to comprehend, but I appreciate very much that you tried to capture the essence of the current issues of travel, and not just travel. As you said, the consumerism, consumption pattern, values and ethics, and other things. And that actually convinces me that eventually the individual behavior, the social behavior has to change. Of course, the political economy, they are also have to make major changes. Now, over-tourism is now being used. To what extent is it really over-tourism? Do we exactly know? I'm not sure. But what I was more concerned about, that what percentage of people are adversely affecting the environment by over-tourism. A very small percentage of total population of the world. There are millions of people who would not be thinking of tourism at all, because they are more concerned with trying to make their ends meet, trying to provide their daily necessities. So when we are talking of tourism, traveling, etc., we are actually addressing the issues of people who, many of them are over-consuming the resources of the earth. I think the dent has to be made there in that social sector. The people who are really adversely affecting the world natural resources and so on. I am not sure if there would be any major policies in the government to address the issue that I have raised. what concern we have is not for the majority of the population of the world, but it is more for the minority group who are actually contributing to the over tourism and whatever you say, destruction of the natural resource and so on. So that's my observation, but I would like to hear from you.
I think that my perspective would be, I mean, you are right. There is a minority of people who are over-consuming. And I think one of the things that needs to be addressed is actually allowing some people to consume more, but some people to consume much less. I think one of the issues that you often have with some of those people who cause problems in consumption is that if they look at themselves, they don't think they are. But the reality is only about, I think even now the figure, only about 7% of the world's population have ever been on a plane. And, you know, it's those that small, at a global scale, it's that small minority who travel so much and countries want to attract for the income they bring, which is a big part of the problem. Now, it wouldn't be so bad if those people were actually paying the real cost of their travel. If in terms of environmental tax or social tax, which is what really needs to happen. That would help enormously. If those kind of measures can be brought in, it can have a positive effect. And then that money can then be transferred into projects which help improve the environment, help the poor, you know, involve more people. For example, one thing I'm interested in is how in rural areas, for example, how can tourists pay for public transport, which then local people can use? So you have that kind of transfer idea. So I think it can be done, but I think you need governments to actually want to charge the real cost of going to a location. If you're in business, you want to charge the real cost so as to get return on investment. So I think we need to use that kind of thinking to encourage government to be doing the same for their destinations and for their countries.
Sorry, your microphone is mute. Honorable Vice Chancellor, your microphone is mute. Honorable Vice Chancellor, your microphone is mute. Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Professor Hall, thank you very much for your answer. I think it's a wonderful suggestions. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yusuf Khan, you may go ahead.
Yes, thank you, sir. Looking at the facial expression, I think Professor Dr. Aziz Sultanul Aziz would like to ask something, sir.
Okay, I'll probably take one more.
Professor Sultanul Aziz. Sir, your microphone is mute.
I just unmuted.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I will also speak later on because I will be attending a whole seminar. But as our Vice Chancellor has said, excellent presentation. Took some mental and written notes. It was very extensive, very penetrating issues, and it's not going to be an easy scenario. I'm in the US right now and fully aware of the COVID-related tourism. I myself have possibly did some tourism in over 50 countries, but right now I'm stuck in the US, Pennsylvania, New York border, state border is about 1 hour drive from my house. I'm in with my daughter in my US stay. And some time ago, there was a notification if I go to the border, I have to either show all the certifications or have 14 days of sort of stuck in somewhere, some hotel or some place at my cost before I'm clear to enter the state. And things are getting worse and worse at this time. And this does not focus directly to many of the issues our Professor Micheal Hall has issued, and I will bring them up one by one. And towards the end, I will also bring some overall suggestions from my experience of global, not pandemic, but cholera pandemic, how I handle the cholera situation in several continents. Thank you for this opportunity for me.
Thank you very much, Professor Sultan Al-Aziz. I think we have our next speaker already here, so we will have just one or two quick questions. I have already a question from Sakib bin Alam. Sakib, you have asked about 2 questions. We can only allow you for only 1 question, and that has to be a short question, please. Sakib bin Alam.
Thank you, sir. So my question is, you are talking about that we have a single world, we cannot have any more. So do you think that is the right time we think about space tourism? It's like tourism from our Earth to Moon or Earth to Mars. Do you think it's the right time?
I actually have quite an interest in space tourism. In another life, my major interest is actually cosmology, but we won't go there. I think in terms of space tourism, yes, it is going to happen. It is very energy intensive. And I think what worries me is that I think in the long term, I can imagine a scenario of space tourism. But even now, what we need in terms of space tourism is making sure the places where the space tourists go and the commercial interests involved don't destroy another planet and destroy another heritage, because that's what is happening with the current commercialization of both space and in terms of the moon and potentially of Mars. I mean, because like if you think of the moon, we have this wonderful, I call it future heritage of where Apollo landed and that sort of thing. What protection is there going to be from that in terms of space tourism? And all we're doing is transferring some of the issues on Earth to there. And I think, therefore, we need to have structures in place. Look, I think in terms of the other aspect of space tourism, in terms of the environment, the costs are very high. If you're going to have it, those costs need to be paid. And it should be. And I you know, in that sense, I think, yes, there will always be a niche market, but it'll be small. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fahaduz Zaman, you had a question. Could you please clarify how 11 USD makes a carbon neutral holiday? Professor Micheal Hall, would you like to answer that, or you will send the article on that?
I will put the article as a reference, and people can get hold of it. It's free on ResearchGate. If I go through and explain the article, I'll be here for another hour. But you know, essentially, you're paying for the offsets. You're paying for the offset, and that's the cost. But all the calculations are there.
Okay, one last question we can take is from Hasibul Islam Tanvir. Could you please make a very short question, please? And Imran Hussain, we will give you an advantage on the next session, please.
Hello,
Hasibul.
sir. I'm Hasibul Islam Tanvir, and my question is what are the factors we have to give importance to make a place sustainable for tour and tourists?
I think the starting point is to think about the local people. I won't use the Maori, but in New Zealand, what is important, it is people, it is people, it is people. That's where you start off. To have a sustainable destination, don't think about the tourists first, you think about the local people first. And what is in place for them. And that in itself will be what is of interest to tourists when they come in. Local people will be more comfortable. You have visiting friends and relations travel, all of those sorts of things. But what your starting point as people, and from that, the local environment. That's where you start from. And that's most important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Micheal Hall. Certainly, we are not taking any more questions from Micheal Hall. We really would like to thank Professor Micheal Hall for giving his valuable time. Although we had some time confusions because of the daylight, but it was an honor to have Professor Micheal Hall with us. Thank you very much, Michael.